Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am very excited to have an amazing panel here this afternoon. We're going to hear some phenomenal people speak on a very needed discussion, and that's why they're all willing to be here to take time out of their busy schedules to join us and share information across the country and, as we found out last time, across the world on the topic of police and individual responsibility and accountability in conflict. So we're actually going to start with Dr. Catherine Coleman. Dr. Coleman has a double bachelor's degree in criminal justice and psychology, a master's in forensic psychology, and of course her doctorate is in psychology. She's licensed and based in the state of Arizona, licensed also in California, Colorado, and Hawaii, with telehealth, if you're not in any of those states, across a dozen more. She is a board member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. She's a member of the National Sheriff's Association also, as well as a dozen other expertise organizations, and has shared her expertise on, get this, Newsmax, CBS, Fox News, One American News, and more. So I'm very excited to have her sharing her expertise here with us today. Dr. Coleman, let's start with talking about the mentality of people in conflict. Can you tell us a little about how conflict changes our thought processing?
Yeah, so when you think about conflict, I think it really first we have to understand how conflict even arises. And so typically, conflict will heat up when there's three different conditions present. So the first is going to be controversial or limited data that's subject to different interpretations. So there's different perspectives or viewpoints, high uncertainty, and high stakes. And so I think, when you look over the past year and a half, we certainly have all of these conditions met when we're talking about the conflict that really ensued between law enforcement and particular community groups. And this is even more amplified when there's different value or belief systems, or if there's different interests or incentives involved. And then there's really two types of conflict. So task conflict is kind of like what we're doing right now, which is, we're talking about what ideas can we generate to reduce conflict between law enforcement and the community. So this is a good type of conflict, right? It's healthy. It's what we would call cool conflict, because while there's emotions involved, our reasoning abilities are still really intact. But what we've seen a lot over the past year and a half is relational conflict, which is a lot more emotional. It's counterproductive. And so what this looks like, rioting, really polarizing viewpoints on both sides of the spectrum, name calling, with ACAB, FTP, and all of that stuff. So all in all, conflict can be healthy, but it isn't when the goal becomes to win rather than cooperate or understand. And that's really when our thought processes and cognitions begin to change with conflict, is when we are focused on winning the argument rather than understanding the other side. Which is why I really appreciate what Peace is doing with trying to kind of bridge the gap and understand both sides of things. So if any of you who are listening or watching have ever read the book True Believers, it was written many years ago, but it really gets into talking about conflict and how people can become so polarized. And so people get very into their own perspective. They want to win, and it further divides people. And so the further people are divided, it makes them feel like the other side does not understand them, which then only validates and amplifies strong opinions. So then it becomes this vicious cycle. And really the only way to stop it is to kind of take a step back and try to think about this from a reasonable perspective.
So we're talking about police officers who really spend their lives throwing themselves in the middle of that, much like one of our next guests who will be coming up. But talk to us about that mentality. What does that do to police officers to be continually exposed to that? Because we're not talking about them dealing with that good, cool conflict, that task conflict that you talked about, but they're in the middle of people at their worst days with that emotional conflict. What does that do to them?
So for the most part, I would argue that law enforcement does approach conflict from that cool mindset. So a good officer that's trained well, who's resilient, um, and is really kind of at their baseline and doing well, is going to be able to approach conflict in that way. They're going, when they're on a scene of domestic violence, for example, they don't take things personally if they're called names. They're able to separate the issues between two people. And try to reason with both sides logically. The problem that we're seeing is that officers are under an extreme amount of stress now, and that stress really when they're stressed, that ability to filter and reason and determine whether something is personal or not is decreased. So now all of a sudden, when a person calls an officer a name, rather than being able to brush it off, maybe they're internalizing a little bit more and taking it personally and taking it to heart. And so then their response then becomes more emotional. And so that's going to get amplified the more stressed out a person is. So typically you're, unemotional, but you're right. Like they are constantly dealing with high stress situations where they're having to manage conflict, and things can escalate very quickly, as we've seen, in the past year and a half between two sides when there is a lot of conflict and emotion involved.
I need to unmute. I would assume that then uh, has a wearing effect on them. What's the long-term effect of that? Is it a compounding effect?
Over time, absolutely. So stress over time creates this cumulative stress and cumulative trauma for officers. And if they don't deal with it well, eventually it kind of just boils over like a boiling pot. And so, I'm obviously a huge proponent of officer wellness and wanting officers to get the right mental health care that they need, making sure that we're taking care of them, because the more that they're taken care of, the better able they're going to be able to perform and do their job and serve their communities. So it all really goes hand in hand. But another thing to consider too is that for many officers, this job is their identity. And so when they begin to feel personally attacked, or they feel like their job, and in many cases like this, their identity, if they feel like that is under attack, or they may be potentially stripped of that, then that's going to also increase stress. So it's really becomes this spiral.
So then I'm following you correctly. We're in an emotional situation and then they're attacked personally, or I'm sorry, they feel because they're identifying with their job that they're attacked personally. It really spirals them downward into a negative situation.
Absolutely.
So I would be asking our chief, Neil Gang, who unfortunately today is busy dealing with his chief responsibilities, the downside of trying to schedule somebody in a 24/7 job. But I will ask Daryl Davis to respond a little bit to that. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Davis uh, has a base as a career musician and actor, and became a self-established race reconciliator. He is the subject of the film Accidental Courtesy and the author of the book outcoming The Klan Whisperer. So stay tuned and watch for that publication. Mr. Davis, as an individual who has, and that story is told in Accidental Courtesy. I don't want to steal a bunch from the film, but as a black man who has walked into Ku Klux Klan members' houses, you are an individual who has faced the possibility of tremendous violence. So, what do you see in that violent cycle that police and citizens can deal with? You're muted, sir. It's catchy.
Sorry about that. Very similar to what the doctor said. People taking emotions and putting them before them instead of keeping them behind them, begins to escalate. But also, she said something very important: is the stripping of identity, and that is what amps up the emotions. Just like when police officers are stopping you for whatever reason, or you're encountering them, and then they're being called names, their mothers are being talked about, or whatever that you want to offend them with. It's going to push their emotions to the forefront for some of them who are not trained to keep them behind them. Well, the same thing is equal to citizens. When I've been pulled out of a car, or not pulled out, but asked to step out of my car for no good reason, and I have cooperated with the officer, and then he's trying to make me sit on the curb, that is stripping me of my identity. And that amps up my emotion. So then it becomes a conflict. Like, for example, I'm here in the DC area, and some years ago we had what was called the DC sniper, who was going around shooting people, and everybody seemed to think the guy was driving a white van. Well, guess who had a white van for his band? Me. So I was constantly being pulled over and asking to step out the vehicle, and the cops want to search my vehicle and all that kind of stuff. And I, of course, cooperated. Hey, no problem. Here's my license, blah blah blah. And most of them were very positive encounters. Thank you. We're just routinely stopping everybody, et cetera, et cetera. Appreciate your cooperation. Every now and then, somebody will pull over a white van, meaning mine, and get all indignant and try to reduce me to something less than themselves. Sit on the curb, blah blah blah. No, I'm not sitting on the curb. And then we would get into it, and then they'd have to call in other officers, and finally I would prevail, and then I'd have to go file a complaint against this officer. I've cooperated. I've done everything the guy asked me to do. I've produced my registration, et cetera, et cetera. So why should I not be treated as an equal or as somebody who is cooperating? So, we each have to learn how to keep our emotions behind us, but not reduce the identity or strip the identity of the other, whether it's a citizen stripping the identity of a police officer, or a police officer stripping the identity of an individual. And I had a discussion with the internal affairs investigator when I filed the complaint against the officer. And I said, why does this particular officer have to yell and scream at the person who is being stopped? And what I was told was that was part of the training here in Montgomery County, Maryland at the time, to put the person on notice and get them to a situation where they're going to be cooperative. I was already cooperating, so why all the yelling and screaming? All that is doing is escalating the situation. I wasn't yelling and screaming, but I understand. It may work in certain circumstances, but it all depends upon the individuals too. If you're dealing with some little old lady from Pasadena or something, yelling and screaming might keep her in her place. But somebody who is just as strong-willed as you are it's not going to work.
Yeah, I could probably understand more if the officer had one of those very taxing days, right? We all have situations that just push us to our brink, and then you happen to be the guy stopped at the tail end of that horrendous day. I could probably understand that more than that's their training. I do wish Chief Gang were on to address that. He's taking his department, I know, in a completely different direction from that, and I would hope that isn't any longer the training process for the county. But if I heard correctly, I don't want to put words in your mouth. If I heard correctly, I'm breaking it down as both sides, both police and citizens in those high conflict situations, can simply stop responding with their emotion, look for the individual that is on the other side of that situation, and try to treat them as an equal. Is that a very simple?
Absolutely, unless a threat is being posed. Like if of course, if I have something in my hand and the guy's telling me to put it down because he can't see what it is, whatever, obviously I need to put it down. If I don't put it down, he may, amplify his what? I'm ordering you now, put it down now, or whatever. I get that part. But if everything is cool, nothing is in my hand, I'm not posing any kind of threat, just to come on to me like gangbusters, or any citizen, I'm just saying me, simply puts that citizen on edge. And the fact that the guy has come to the end of the day and he's on the brink, that's not my problem.
Right.
That's his problem. I might be at the end of the day as well. I'll give you an example of something. This happened for real. I was in college at the time, and I wanted to buy the music librarian her favorite perfume, because she was so nice to me, as a Christmas present. And this other girl that that I liked, I'm gonna buy her some perfume as well. So I went to the department store in the mall to buy the perfume, and it was very, very busy. Everybody's Christmas shopping, and the lady behind the counter, maybe she was at the end of her day, and I asked her if she, when it's finally my turn, I said, do you have Alliage? And she said, we do not carry Estee Lauder products. Now, I don't know Estee Lauder from Avon, from Mary Kay, or anybody else. All I'm asking for is Alliage. I don't know who makes it, right? So she came on to me like that. And I said, oh, okay. And so I then asked for the other perfume from my other friend, and I forgot now what it was called. But apparently, it too was a Estee Lauder product. And she screamed at me, I said, we do not carry Estee Lauder products. Well, I lost it. And I told her she could take whatever products she did have. And I told her what she could do with them. And the whole floor went silent. All you could hear was the Christmas music playing overhead. And a lady walked up to me who was standing nearby, and she said, sir, I believe you can find both those products at Woodward and Lothrop, down the corridor. I was at Heck Company. I said, thank you. And I went on down to Woody's and purchased the products. Now, this third party who was not involved in this, I guess you'd call it an altercation or conversation between myself and the cosmetic lady at the Heck Company, she came over and diffused the situation. I was happy. The other lady calmed down, and I left the store. I would have left the store anyway. But if you are in a public place, whether you're a salesperson or a police officer or a receptionist or the doorman at a hotel, you are dealing with the public. From the beginning of your shift to the end of your shift, you need to be as polite at the end of your shift as you are when you first sign on. And if you can't handle that, then you ask your supervisor for a transfer where you don't have to deal with the public, or you tell somebody, hey, I just need a mental break for a few minutes, and go outside and do whatever you have to do to calm down and come back and deal with the public. I get it. Customers can be a pain in the butt. I get it, but we all have that responsibility to treat one another as human beings. And it is incumbent upon us as citizens. It is incumbent upon us as law enforcement officers, because if we're going to work in tandem together, then there has to be that relationship.
Right. I think officers now more than ever need to watch that. Remember that every minute their actions are accountable, not just on them, but across the board. I want to turn now to a gentleman who's become a good friend, founder of Beyond Barriers. Jeff Shope was actually the leader of the largest neo-Nazi organization in the United States for 27 years. And so think about this gentleman who is now on a panel speaking about conflict resolution. He led the National Socialist Movement and is now, much thanks to Mr. Daryl Davis, helping those who want to leave extremist movements adjust to society. Now, Mr. Shope, I think I know that much of your work is in conflict resolution, and you're working on offering those programs to both police departments and communities. How do you see those conflict resolution skills helping in the situations that we're talking about?
Well, thanks again for having me, Anthony. And I'd like to say everything Daryl and Catherine said was incredibly important and excellent points. And what we can do, I think, coming from a citizen standpoint is, we've heard a little bit about, police responsibility and things of that nature, but from a citizen's role as well, we have to look at this from a lot of the citizens, especially over the past year and a half with the rallies and riots and things like that, have been very nasty, I guess, for lack of a better word, towards police departments. And we have to remember that the person standing across from you, whether they're wearing a badge and a gun, or whether they're wearing civilian clothes, or whether they're military, doesn't matter. We are all Americans. We are all human beings. We need to reconnect with our humanity. We have to start seeing one another as human beings. And a lot of dehumanization has been done, especially coming from the community side towards the police departments. And I believe a lot of that, the media plays a heavy role in that, amplifying very negative stories, very news grabbing headlines and things like that. When something terrible happens in a police department in a specific incident, it's all over the news. It's re-amplified, it's re-amplified, it's re-amplified. And I think we all know that mistakes are made and there's horrible things that happen and people make mistakes. And instead of pointing out that in these specific instances that perhaps that particular officer made a mistake, that is not reflective upon entire police departments or on the entire policing industry. This is a big problem. And I believe without, going after the media per se, that the media does play a role in that, and they have a responsibility in not behaving in that manner. That's one of the things we're seeing with the polarization in the country right now. And why I speak about these things is coming from the past background that I have. I was one of those polarizers. I was one of the, key people that was organizing this type of, negativity and hate and divisions between the American people. So who better to speak about that than somebody that was once, a victimizer, someone that was once, engaged in these things. We understand how that works, how people can get to that point, and how to deprogram that, how to reverse those trends, like basically through a reverse osmosis project through our programs. And a lot of that has to do with de-escalation as well. If you're talking to somebody, you're out on the street, you're having a conversation, and you're screaming and hollering in their face, just like my colleague and friend Daryl had said there, people aren't going to listen. Your ears shut off. And that's a pretty common outlook. So I think what we need to do, and really where we're coming from, is by changing the hearts and minds of people. And that's one of the things that we're very good at, clearly. And I'd say Daryl's one of the absolute best in the country. Daryl's personally, helped over 200 Klansmen walk away from that life. So, we're onto something here, and we're trying to, bring that into the mainstream society and take our skill set and the things that we've learned from our lived experience and bring that into healing the relationship between the police and the community.
Hey, Anthony, if I could just dovetail into what Jeff said here.
Absolutely.
I was well aware of Jeff's background before I met him. And I'd seen him on TV. I'd seen him, on YouTube. I've seen him at his rallies. And, this was a strong proponent of racism. He wasn't somebody, that I thought, is going to be, one of my best friends. Okay. And when in the movie Accidental Courtesy, he was asked to come and have a conversation with me. And so I was prepared as well. So I my image of Jeff, I mean, I knew what he looked like, but my persona of him was, this hateful person. He hated Jews, he didn't like blacks, He's violent, he's vicious, he's a leader of the biggest Nazi party in the country, etc. So, you know, I had all these things in my head. And when I arrived, I was expecting to see, because the filming was set up so that he would already be in place. I was going to come in, sit down, and we're going to have this conversation. So I'm geared, you know, to focus on that, and I'm sure he was as well. But when I arrived, he was not in place. In fact, he was on break outside, sitting on a bench. And I recognized him when I pulled in the parking lot. And I said, oh, you know, that looks like, you know, like the guy. And so I got out of the vehicle and I walked over to him. And I said, hi, are you Jeff? He goes, yeah. I said, I'm Daryl. And we just started talking. And man, you know, we just talked like just two people, you know, in the park. And we got to know each other in those 5 minutes before we walked in. It was hard, I think, on his part and on mine to have any vitriol towards one another, because we had treated each other as human beings. And, you know, that stayed with me. That stayed with me. And I know it stayed with Jeff. It may not have matriculated or manifested itself overnight. All right. But that stayed with him, and that stayed with me. And, you know, and as we talked in the movie, we were very friendly. And then I think it reached a point where Jeff forgot why he was there. And then he came out of his thing, like, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But then after the filming was over, you know, I hung out with him for a few minutes again, and we talked and we exchanged phone numbers. And I think that initial contact for both of us, I saw the humanity in him, regardless of what I'd seen on TV before meeting him. He saw the humanity in me, and that stuck with him. And that was a stepping stone towards his change of direction.
And I think that's key. First of all, Mr. Davis, I have to say that I take some heart to hear that at some point you lost it on somebody. For those
it's human
of us,
being, we're humans. Yeah.
It goes to prove the point that you are human. And Jeff, I'm sure that's somewhat. I watched your face as he was talking, and I was chuckling a little bit to hear how that was set up. I'm sure that's somewhat difficult to hear, that you were at one point so against somebody who has so much to offer.
Yeah, it was Daryl definitely planted a seed, and it was something that really resonated with me for a long time. And it's one of the things that we've learned in the work that we do too, is that by humanizing the other, rather, or in the case of with extremists, getting to rehumanize, because they've literally lost that humanity. It's not gone, it's not missing, it can be reobtained, but it's behind that barrier, it's behind that wall where they've lost that connection. They've become isolated, they become behind these barriers. And that's one of the things, one of the, tactics maybe isn't the right word, but one of the programs we use is basically to reconnect people with that humanity, show them like Daryl showed me his humanity. That's really what hit me harder than anything. And within the next year or 6 months was meeting a Muslim filmmaker by the name of Dia Khan, who did the same thing, showed their humanity, and that reconnected something deep inside. And I think that's key to the work that we're doing here between even citizens and the police, because there's a lot of dehumanizing, especially coming from the community directed towards the police, that the police are these terrible people that, everybody saw that, one terrible incident on the news, and they are dehumanizing the police. And coming from somebody who was a dehumanizer in the past, I know what it looks like, I know what it's about, and that's what's being done. And I think it's terrible. It's not good for the profession. And if you break it down even further, it's not good for our country, because what it's doing is that fine line, that thin blue line, is what is keeping anarchy at bay, is what is keeping criminals at bay. We can have this perfect vision of society where everybody's going to get along just fine, but it's the criminals, the psychopaths, the sociopaths, those people would take advantage of a system without policing. So we need to, the general public needs to think about that when they're dehumanizing that officer that's across from them, whether you agree with what they're doing or not, whether you're at a protest and you're speaking against them, you have the right to do that. But don't dehumanize the other. Don't dehumanize the person that's standing across from you. Remember, that's a father, that's a mother, that's someone's daughter, that's someone's son. And a lot of times I know it, but when you're involved in these extreme movements and we're seeing that spill over into mainstream society, you're dehumanizing other people. I got off a phone call with an individual just last night that had reached out for help, and they had been in the movement many years ago, this individual, and now they're quite conservative, and they were going off about how anyone that voted for Joe Biden was scum and just some of the most terrible things you can imagine. And it's like, where is this coming from? And you're having this polarization in the country where even between the political parties now, it's not just a racial thing. This is going on all over the country. And between Democrats and Republicans, people are getting this radical, and it's a shame. So we need to work on that as a community, as a country. I think I went a little long there on my answer, but
that's all right. There's some stuff we're going to come back to, but I want to get our last guest on and get some of her thoughts, because she has a very unique perspective. Dr. Curacao has spent her life in studying human rights practice, really. She is also, for those of you who are military supporters, she is a U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard veteran, where she has 2 active duty wartime service tours, and is a medal winner, an Air Force Humanitarian Service Medal winner for her performance as a first responder. A member of the American Indian movement, she is a leading expert on Indigenous peoples and their way of life. So, Dr. Curacao, I know we've spoken just a little bit, and the Indigenous people have a unique way of dealing with conflict to begin with, and their public order. So what are they doing for their public order system?
Well, I mean, there's so much to say about it, but I'll give you a little more background because I forgot to bring credentials. My doctorate studies is Applied Linguistics, American Indian Studies, Tribal Law, Master's Forensic Psychology, right on, right? Human Rights Practice, and again, AIS and Appling. So I bring all that. I'm an empirical researcher, and I'm an expert in conflict resolution and mediation, as well as just being Indigenous, which, yes, that means that my whole life has been a human rights struggle. Ha ha. In your context of what you're speaking about, peace, police relations, law, justice, conflict resolution, and as a linguist, I noticed the language being used had a lot to do with things like cooperation, agency, identity, and you've all described what happens when we weaponize language. The Cree people, my people, were called Iyiniyu. Just so you know who we are. We're in Canada, Quebec. For 150 years, we've had a Western judicial system imposed on us through the Indian Act, so that they put chiefs and counselors on top of how we conduct what we call justice. But for all of our existence, we've had the traditional system, which is not punitive. The main difference between the way we practice justice and the Western way is that we see the consequence as harm. We do not see the consequence as punishment. So therefore, we do not enact punishment. It does no good for an individual who's committed harm and is now responsible to participate in reconciliation for it, to sit and rot in a jail cell where he can do nothing. It does no good for someone like Jeff, other extremists, to leave an extremist movement and be so vilified and persecuted that there's nothing they can do for reconciliation. that they cannot participate in the restoration of justice, even as the perpetrator. There's a massive cultural difference. How that relates to both leaving hate and how that relates to police community relations. When the society, when the people, and you have to remember indigenous relations with federal and law agencies is as bad as it gets. Why hasn't our situation exploded into what we saw a couple years ago? AIM was founded in response to police brutality. All right. One thing that kept us from it getting worse was our sense of justice. Respect and trust has to be established, or there can't be any reconciliation. When society sees the police as having breached that, okay, no respect, no trust, when they pull you out of a car just because reasons and you're sitting and being yelled at, you have conflict. When agency is involved, as Daryl says, don't strip my identity. I'm the agent. You're asking me to act. I have as much agency as you have bullets in your gun, but your bullets are going to outnumber me. Now I'm protecting myself and defending my life. These are the worst case situations, as all police officers know. Most police officers never. That's what they're there for, is to stop these things from happening. When everybody's the bad guy and nobody understands responsibility, accountability, and nobody calls justice healing, the harm can't be repaired, the trust and respect can't be restored, the role in the community can't be revitalized. The police officers and the extremists are also mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. The humanity's gone. When we, as a linguist, big brain linguists do, Dr. Coleman probably understands psycholinguistics, right? You know how we are. When we weaponize language, for instance, I'm a conflict resolution expert with a special training model. It's used at Supreme Court, Tribal Court, the United Nations, etc. The Cree practice, it's built into our native language, is to remove the pronouns. I cannot point at you. We can only speak of the problem. There is no I, there is no you, there's no opposition. That's how we handle it linguistically. Daryl has sat for a little touch of that and intuitively understood the principle of speaking with agency while leaving the door fully open for the other. Intuitively grasped it. Several other members of Beyond Barrier staff had sat for it. They intuitively grasped it. As soon as the pronouns came out, they were like, oh, it's just about the problem. Yes. If that were incorporated into police training, you would see a de-escalation, because the person being pulled out of the car isn't being constantly pointed at with two things: words, barking, and a gun, biting. All of these imply death, danger, guilt. It's one thing to cooperate, it's another thing to be coerced into compliance. So in my background, I've had to live my entire life in these kind of conflicts. I used to be what's called a head lady on what we used to call the powwow highway, which is a medicine drum that was brought out to do ceremonies. In our area, especially in Deep South, where I'm from, the relationship with any law enforcement, Wildlife and Gaming Commission, of course, was incredible. It was in the Border Patrol law with federal agents. It was pretty clear that they weren't interested in conversations with us. All encounters with them resulted in 3 out of 10 times death, arrest, injury, or disappearance. So I spent 3 years on that drum because I used to be in AIM as a target to let's bring this to a head. These things were done to us in private, not in public, as Daryl mentioned. So you can see how that relationship was not good. What kept us alive and well through all of it was the fact that Yiniyu, the word for Cree, it actually means human being. Is the fact that our cultural concept is that in our culture, even the community takes responsibility when a crime has been committed. Can you imagine? Nobody acts on their own. We didn't come into the world on our own. We're not going out on our own. Any harm done to one of us, therefore, is done to all of us. Therefore, all of us, the guy with a gun, the thief, the liar, the abuser, the victim, the family, the community, the mediators, culture itself, all of this sits together. No matter how much you kick and scream and throw a fit and get nasty and cover your butt up and walk away and lie about it, what you did, all of us will sit together to get to the truth. Because if you tell us the truth about what you've done, you've kept the respect. If you say, I think that I can do this to make this better, then you've chosen to keep the trust. How do we get the trust and respect back between police officers, who are somebody's sons and fathers and mothers and daughters, and the community, before it ends up like what happened to us at Wounded Knee? That is the key question here. Our concept of justice, Anthony, you might be happy to hear about it, is the word translates in English to peace. That's what justice means. But it means to be at peace with oneself. That is justice. With oneself. That's when we know justice has been served. It's a very different concept. When I train in this method, it works. There are options out there for resolution. The need is great. Yes, people are killing and dying. And not even extremists. You know, no offense, people we expect to do this. No, ordinary citizen. The impact on the police community? Devastating.
Yeah,
So,
as Jeff said, the radicalization of not movements, not extremists, but of our country has a lot to do with situations not just between police and community members, but Republicans and Democrats, and there's so much going on with all of that. I do want to get to a viewer question. Dr. Coleman, as our psychological expert, some states require and some do not require psychological testing of police officers. Do you support psychological testing of future police officers, and do you find that it can benefit by predicting behavior on the job?
So, yes, absolutely, I support it. So, the International Association of Chiefs of Police has guidelines for pre-employment evaluations, which is the type of evaluation that you're referring to in this question. It gets revised about every 4 to 5 years, and I was the chair of the most recent revision, actually. So, hugely supportive of this process. Most states require it. It's definitely the gold standard, because we want to make sure that officers go into this job suitable to work in public safety, but also stable enough to manage the pressures. Downside, of course, is that after they're hired, life happens. And so you don't know if the person's going to go through a divorce, or they're going to witness trauma, or there's, they're going to experience death in the family. All sorts of problems can arise. It's unpredictable. But yes, huge support of it. The return on investment for agencies who go through the process, I think, is huge, because the cost of having to do an evaluation before you, after you give them a conditional offer, then you would test them. But the return on investment is beneficial, because the cost for doing the evaluation is nothing compared to the cost of what an excessive use of force lawsuit would cost, or defending an officer that engages in other bad behavior on the job, and the amount of cost of training officers. So I'm a huge proponent of it, and I hope to see that states across the country will all adopt it.
Yeah, I think much like in teaching, there's an issue with it there with a lack of funding, because while you said you gave that qualification that the cost of the evaluation is nothing compared to the response of an officer with inappropriate actions. I know for a lot of smaller agencies, they look at that few $100s, and that's a huge cost when they've got somebody who is otherwise state approved by some kind of training or qualification. So I will jump in on Chief Gang's response there, since he's not able to be with us today. But I do wholeheartedly agree with you. I think it is worth it. I think it needs to be done, and much like the training that is offered by Peace or Beyond Barriers or Dr. Kirkhow, there's that matter of lack of funding. So folks, if you're watching, feel free to reach out, contact your senator and congressman, and ask for some of the government tax dollars that we all contribute to are used to further police training and further qualification for our police officers, because once they're on the job, we have to deal with them, and that's one of the questions that we will forward to Chief Gang. Maybe he can answer later on. Once they're on the job, there's a more difficult process to remove somebody than there is to get them on to begin with. Jeff, we talked about encounters and the dehumanization. I want, if you would, for a minute, address the dehumanization of police as we look at them being the face of issues across society. I think, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because people have to deal with police, and that might be the result of many other governmental organizations that they've been involved with. Police are the front line. Do you see part of that as being a problem? Is that increase or dehumanization of them?
Yes, I do, because it's what the citizen sees. So when they think of something that they don't like in society, I've seen it in my lived experience at rallies over the years. The far right would go out, have a rally, and the far left would come and attack police, attack the far right. Typically, if there wasn't police there, sometimes there wasn't fighting. There was a incident I remember, I believe it was in Austin, Texas, years ago, and it was the far right and the far left were out there, and it was at the state capitol, and there was quite a few. The far left quite outnumbered the far right, and they were getting closer and yelling and hollering and things, but there wasn't any violence. And there was no police. And at some point during this, about 20 minutes into the rally, the police all had come out of the state capitol and started, walling off like a human shield, a human wall around the area to keep the two sides separate. The moment they came out, the far left extremists who really have an issue with police, they started pushing the police, throwing rocks, more at the police than at the far right. So there's a lot of that type of behavior that goes on, and I don't think they're dehumanizing as well. They're dehumanizing those people. They're not seeing that officer as an individual. And it's easy to do that. It's easy to do that from the other side, looking back too. Coming out of the experience that I had in the extreme far right, you dehumanized entire groups of people all the time. So coming from that perspective and realizing that and understanding how important that is to deprogram people from thinking in that way. We really, the simple answer is we have to start seeing each other as human beings once again, and not seeing it as, well, that guy's a police officer, that guy's a Democrat, that guy's a Republican. And I was guilty of it too. I mean, I remember anybody to me that was on the left was a communist. It was just that wasn't accurate, but they were just all thrown into that category. And that was that way for years. And people would say, well, what do you mean that guy's a communist? Isn't he a Democratic Party member, or isn't he with this? So why you say communist? I said, they're all just thrown in that box, so, and it's not just extremists that do this. A lot of people do this, and they'll just look at the police department and say, this is just a bunch of, terrible people. And it's not accurate. It's not even close to accurate. And we as a society have to stop doing that. This is a societal problem. And it's a way that we look at one another. And it's something I feel like is maybe not being taught as well in the schools as it should be, because, we all grew up and we all remember our parents saying, treat others as you would want to be treated. And we don't see a lot of that now. When you think about that, how these people treat one another, no one wants to be treated like that. I don't care what side you're on. It's not right. So I think coming from a human perspective, we just need to be a little better to each other.
Point very well made. I see heads on the panel nodding. As we wrap, we're closing in on an hour here. We're going to wrap up. I want to give each of our panelists just a couple of minutes for parting thoughts. Mr. Davis, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, sure. I want to add to what Jeff was saying. Now, I'm not saying that every reason is justifiable, but I do want to explain why some of that or where some of that anti-police rhetoric does come from. It may not always be justifiable, but there are reasons why it evolves. In the past, oftentimes police have been the perpetrators of violence on minorities. We look at 3,000 peaceful Black marchers marching to the courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, just to register to vote, when the police chief named Eugene Bull Connor called out the police dogs and the fire hoses and just attacked these people. We've seen many incidents of that, where the Greensboro massacre just a few years back, where I knew the guy who orchestrated that, the head of the Klan, Virgil Griffin, who got away with it. He had arranged for the police not to be present when the Klan shot and killed 5 Communist Worker Party members, and then the police show up after the scene. Same thing with the Birmingham bus station beatings and fire bombings of the Freedom Riders. The police had arranged with the Klan to not be present, so the Klan could come in and beat up the people who were trying to integrate the Greyhound bus station in Birmingham. Same guy, Eugene Bull Connor. It happened on Mother's Day. The FBI filmed it, but could not do anything because it was a state thing. So, and then when the media asked, well, where were the police when all this was happening? You knew they were coming and the Klan was going to convene. Oh, well, it's Mother's Day. The police were home with their mothers, said Eugene Bull Connor. So, that is not that far back in our minds, which taints, a view of police, especially with older people. So they already have it in their minds. A second thing is this, that a lot of people don't understand the role of the police, which is to protect the constitutional rights of people. The Klan, the neo-Nazis, the far right, the far left, everybody has the right to freedom of assembly, and freedom of speech. And the police must protect those rights, regardless of who is expressing it, whether it's the Klan or the Nazis or whoever. For example, some years back, I was there. The Klan had a march from the Capitol to the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue back in the 1980s here in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, Washington, D.C. is 2/3 Black. The police chief of Washington, D.C. is 2/3 Black. He led the Klan on that. I'm sorry, it was from the White House to the Capitol. He led that march and had his police protecting the Klan so they could exercise their rights. There were probably, I don't know, maybe 50 to 75 robed and hooded Klansmen marching, and there were others who were not in their regalia. But there were thousands of protesters, and it turned violent. The police got attacked. Why? Because they were protecting the Klan. but it was the Klan's right to march, regardless of how despicable their message may be. And so people can understand, well, why are these Black police officers protecting the Klan? They are entitled to the constitutional right also to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and the right to march to the Capitol like anybody else. So, we need to educate our citizenry about the Constitution and its amendments to understand where we may not agree with somebody, but we have to agree to afford them these rights if we want to exercise those same rights ourselves. So that combined with the fact that some of these things, many of these things did occur where the police were at fault through racism or whatever. But we also need to point out that just like anything else, police have evolved. Now, does that mean that there are no more racist police? Absolutely not. There are plenty of them. I know a lot of them myself personally. All right, but they have evolved from the likes of Eugene Bull Connor and his colleagues from back in the day. So we need to educate the public about that as well. Also, I want to wrap it up by saying I agree with the doctor about yes, psychological testing definitely needs to be implemented across all 50 states. And I would even add that there should be two more components, and I'm sure some states probably do this in terms of, yes, once you're hired, as she points out, life happens. People go through divorce or they get jaded on the job, mentality changes and things happen, which is why there should be periodic checkups to make sure that person is still in the same kind of frame of mind that they were in when they joined, or they have evolved for the better and they're not spiraling downwards to being a potential threat to themselves or their law enforcement agency or the community, because those things can happen too. And to put money into this testing is like having insurance. You drive around in your car with no insurance. You may have an accident, you may not, but if you do, it's going to cost you big time. And I would also add that there are tests that can be given, like Harvard has the implicit bias test. There are other ones that can be developed, perhaps even better, that could also be put into these psychological tests when hiring police officers to determine if this person is a good fit in terms of racism or extremism or whatever, or anti-gay, anti-female, anti-whatever. Those things can be determined through some tests.
Well, and that's Dr. Coleman, I'm going to ask you to respond a little bit to that bias testing here in just a second, because I think we part of what we have to recognize, as I heard each of you say, is that we're all different, and to some extent, then we're all going to have biases. So I don't think it's as much about eliminating all the biases as understanding that we can be biased and work with each other a little bit. Much like you mentioned, several incidents where police were used to oppress or to become violent against minorities. In the cases you mentioned, often blacks. Dr. Kurkawa mentioned Indian oppression. I think military, armed forces of all kinds, military and police across the globe have always been used in those oppressive manners in some form. I think we also have to recognize that it's usually those same forces that are then used to fight for freedom. So it's, again, part of that education process that we have to focus on, and I think officer training is making sure officers know when they should refuse an order for the good of their community, so that they're not caught in those situations. But Dr. Coleman, in your closing comments, if you will, just that bit about bias testing, ma'am.
Yeah, and Daryl, I love that you brought that up, because that's been a huge hot topic right now within the police psychological services community, is how can we integrate some of this into our current batteries, because police departments are wanting the answer to this question too, because, I'm sure if Chief Gang was here, he would say, what he always says, which is, no one hates a bad cop worse than a good cop. And that's how agencies feel. And so they want to weed these people out as well. I can say, just kind of having some insider knowledge, that some of the tests that we currently use, there is some research being done on some scales that may have the ability to predict intolerance. Many agencies are requesting that we include language in our reports about whether or not the candidate expressed any kind of bias toward racial or ethnic minority groups. So if they make a comment during their interview that leads us to believe that there may be something there, we're letting agencies know. The most difficult part is psychological tests have to be validated, which takes years of research, and they need to be normed on law enforcement. And so how can we actually predict that bias will lead to problematic actions, right? So a person having a bias is one thing, but how do we know that they're going to act on that bias? And it's a really big deal to say, this person is racist, don't hire them, if they're not. That's like a lawsuit waiting to happen, right? So that's kind of the problem that we're going to be running into. And so I think what we're going to see over the next couple of years is the tests that have already been validated and normed. You're probably going to see additional research utilizing those tests and trying to predict behaviors or poor emotional intelligence, people that are likely going to be unaware of their own biases and therefore kind of subconsciously act on them. So I think that that's what we're going to be seeing. But Daryl, I 100% agree that that's something that needs to be addressed in that hiring process. And so hopefully we can appease everybody and make it happen.
My money is on Dr. Coleman and Dr. Curacao to come up with those perfect tests and to be implemented. Because I know you guys are young. You said it's going to take years. I might not be here then, but you guys will still be here, and you guys can come up with those tests, because I know you all got it up here.
Well, you can't go anywhere, Daryl, before I put that band together that we talked about.
That's
what?
Right.
It's not good.
I didn't
sing the
include,
blues.
folks, I didn't include Dr. Kurakawa's background as a musician as well. So
okay.
Well,
two of them there hit it off on that note. But I think you've each, Mr. Davis and Dr. Coleman, addressed something that becomes a huge issue, that funding matter. First, we have to fund the research. Then we have to fund that additional testing throughout the career. And Mr. Davis had mentioned earlier that often if we're experiencing that high stress, that we should just take that mental break and bring ourselves back into a check. I happen to work for a police department that was against that kind of break, pushing to take call after call after call. So when I know Chief Gang would love to respond to that, because he is a man who asks his officers to make sure that they take that kind of time for themselves. But that's not a standard across the country, something else that we need to push for, unfortunately, extra money to be allocated for. So Dr. Kurakawa, you started to respond to Mr. Davis there. I'll give you your closing comments, and then we'll get to Mr. Schultz.
Mine were short. In respect to your chief, which is a funny title, just so he might know, Cree people have a word we were forced to create for the word chief. It meant a person who signed a treaty. It's called a hukamau. It means pretend chief. Chief Gang has another word. It's Cree. It's too difficult for you, but it means the person who took initiative first for the people. So your chief has earned his proper title. So, but you as a community are responsible to make his job of leading you easier. Second, yeah, there are ways, things like the bias test. Actually, Daryl, I do. You're right. I do administer it. So perhaps Dr. Coleman and myself can sit down and do that. I was really happy because I'm the director of research, training, and outreach for Beyond Barriers, that she said, boss, yeah, it takes a while. See, we've only been doing this a year. It takes a while, right? Okay. There is a way to reconcile the situation, and it's desperately needed. Indigenous people often, there's an old adage, it says that every war chief becomes a peace chief if he can survive himself, because he learns that the loss of even one life is not worth it. Keon.
Huge point. That's a mic drop. The loss of life is never worth it. So, Mr. Shope, the unenviable task of wrapping up after that.
That's impossible. The Lord killed it on that one. Absolutely. No, these are very important conversations, and I just want to echo what I said a little bit earlier, is that I do think it's incredibly important that all aspects of our society, work to humanize one another or rehumanize each other a little bit better, and I think that's incredibly important. And I want to echo, everything everybody said tonight was so good, or excuse me, today was so good. It's really important we take these roles seriously, and as a society that we just do a little bit better. So it's an honor to be here again today, and thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I want to thank each of you for the work you're doing individually, for joining in a discussion to share your knowledge and expertise across the world. That's a huge thanks for that. Special thanks to Acacia Dietz, Managing Director of Beyond Barriers, for hosting this discussion and making all of the technical see, I can't even say technology, making all of the technology work for everyone. Acacia, if you would, for our guests, before we exit, or we can exit and follow up, each of our guests here has websites that you can find them at. I know Beyond Barriers is beyondbarriersusa.org, and you can find Mr. Shope and Dr. Kurokawa on that. Dr. Coleman's is Dr. Coleman, no period, drcoleman.com, and Mr. Davis's is his name, daryldavis.com. So if you have any questions, you can message in. But I thank you all for listening in. Stay graceful.